The wind doesn't knock on doors in the wilderness. It doesn't warn you. It doesn't give you a moment to prepare. 1 second you're warm, fire crackling, breath fogging in the cold air, and the next, something shifts. The silence becomes wrong. The darkness outside your tent becomes heavier than it should be. And somewhere, deep in the rational part of your brain, a voice whispers, "You are very, very far from help." Winter camping. People do it voluntarily. They pack their gear, kiss their families goodbye, and drive toward mountains that look beautiful in photographs and feel entirely different when you're alone inside them at 2 in the morning with temperatures dropping past -20 and something. You're not sure what moving outside your tent. Stay close. Keep the light on. And listen. The first story is called The Tent on Whisper Ridge. In the winter of 2019, a man named Corvus Hale decided to do something he had been planning for 3 years. A 34-year-old high school geography teacher from rural Montana, Corvus had been winter camping since he was a teenager, and he prided himself on doing it alone. He had a saying he used to tell his students, "The mountain doesn't care about your feelings, so learn to feel without falling apart." He was experienced. He was careful. He was, by every reasonable measure, exactly the kind of person who should survive a solo winter camping trip in the Bitterroot Range. He set out on December 27th, just after the holiday, when he knew the trails would be quiet. He had 4 days of food, a 4-season tent rated to -30°C, a reliable sleeping bag, a satellite communicator, a headlamp with fresh batteries, and a secondary headlamp as backup. He had done this exact route twice before in summer and once in late autumn. He knew the terrain. He had marked his campsites in advance. The first night was perfect, he would later write in his journal. Clear sky. Stars like salt on black velvet. He built a small fire, ate a hot meal, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the pines above him. He noted in the journal that the wind sounded almost like breathing, not in a frightening way, in a peaceful way. He wrote, "This is why I come out here. The mountain breathes and I breathe with it." By the second night, things had changed. He had reached the area locals sometimes called Whisper Ridge, a long, narrow plateau about 4,000 feet above the valley floor, flanked on both sides by dense lodgepole pine forest. The name, he knew, came from an old trapper's legend about the area. Something about the wind finding unusual channels through the rocks and creating sounds that resembled whispering. He had always found this charming. A geographical curiosity. Nothing more. He set up his tent on a flat area near a rocky outcropping, just as he had planned. He ate dinner, made some notes in his journal, and climbed into his sleeping bag at around 9 in the evening. The temperature was already sitting at -15°C. He could hear the wind picking up outside, moving through the pines with that low, sliding sound that experienced campers come to love because it means the storm is staying in the trees and not dropping onto the ground. He fell asleep. He woke at 2:17 a.m. He knew the exact time because he checked his watch the moment his eyes opened, a habit he had developed over years of camping. He lay still in his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, and he listened. Something was standing outside his tent. He couldn't see it. He couldn't hear it move. But Corvus Hale had spent enough nights in the wilderness to know the difference between the absence of sound and the presence of stillness. This was the latter. The wind had stopped. The pines had stopped. The entire mountain had gone quiet in the way that animals understand and humans have largely forgotten. The silence of something large and patient holding itself motionless in the dark. He reached slowly for his headlamp. His hands were shaking, and he told himself it was the cold. He told himself this very deliberately. He turned on the light and held it toward the tent wall. There was a shadow, a human-shaped shadow, standing perhaps 3 feet from the fabric of the tent, visible only because of the faint snow-reflected light that filtered through the tent material. It was tall. Not unusually tall, but tall enough. And it was standing perfectly, completely, unnervingly still. Corvus called out. He said hello. He asked if someone was there. His voice came out steadier than he expected, and he was proud of himself for that in a dissociated, almost academic way. There was no answer. He grabbed his emergency whistle, a reflex born of training, and blew 3 sharp blasts. 3 blasts is the universal distress signal in wilderness environments. 3 blasts means I need help. 3 blasts means something is wrong. The shadow didn't move. He stayed in his sleeping bag for what he estimated was 40 minutes, watching the shadow, calling out periodically, getting no response. Then, without any particular movement he could identify, the shadow was gone. The wind came back. The pines started moving again. The mountain exhaled. At first light, Corvus unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The snow around his tent was undisturbed except for his own tracks from the previous evening. No footprints. No animal tracks of any kind. The snow was smooth and blank and perfect in every direction. He packed up camp, completed the remaining 2 days of his route, and returned to his car. He told his wife what had happened. She encouraged him to report it to the ranger station, which he did. The ranger on duty, a weathered woman named Delphine Marsh who had worked the Bitterroot backcountry for 16 years, listened carefully and then said something that Corvus found more disturbing than the shadow itself. She said, "You're the 3rd person this winter to report something standing outside their tent on that ridge. The other 2 left before dawn. I'm glad you stayed put." When he asked what she thought it was, Ranger Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In my experience, what you see in the dark on a mountain is usually either very simple or very complicated. I haven't figured out which one this is yet. There are documented cases of what researchers call hypnagogic hallucination, vivid, realistic perceptions that occur in the transitional state between waking and sleeping. People see figures, hear voices, feel presences. Science has explanations for this. But Corvus Hale was fully awake. His watch said 2:17. He remembers checking it. He remembers the cold on his hands when he reached for the headlamp. He was not dreaming. And the other 2 campers on Whisper Ridge that winter, who nobody had told Corvus about, who couldn't have compared notes with him, they had reported the same thing. A still shadow. Outside the tent. In the night. Ask yourself this. If you woke up right now, in the dark, and saw a shadow standing just outside your window, perfectly still, not moving, not leaving, what would you do? Would you have the nerve to find out what it was? Or would you do what most of us, in that honest, quiet part of ourselves, know we would actually do? You would lie very still. You would pretend to be asleep. And you would wait for morning, hoping it did the same. The second story is called What the Ice Said. In January of 2021, a group of 4 friends from northern Michigan decided to spend New Year's week at a backcountry campsite in the Upper Peninsula, a region that experienced winter campers describe as one of the most simultaneously beautiful and brutal environments in the continental United States. The Up in January is not a gentle place. Temperatures can drop to -40 with wind chill. Whiteout conditions can reduce visibility to 0 in under 3 minutes. And the silence. Campers describe the silence of the Up in deep winter as something almost physical, like a material you could cut with a knife. The 4 friends were a 29-year-old nurse named Oleander Briggs, her boyfriend Thaddeus Wolfe, age 31, a plumber with extensive wilderness experience, their mutual friend Sable Novak, age 27, a graduate student studying environmental science, and Sable's older brother, Fenwick Novak, age 33, who had served 2 tours in the military and considered himself the group's default security officer. They were good people. They were prepared. They were experienced. And for the first 3 days, everything was wonderful. Their campsite was on the shore of a frozen lake called, appropriately enough, Black Ice Lake, a narrow body of water about 2 miles long, surrounded by spruce and birch forest. The ice was solid. Thaddeus had drilled a test hole and confirmed it was over 14 inches thick, more than sufficient to walk on, more than sufficient to be safe. They had set up 2 tents, built a fire ring on the shore, and established a comfortable routine of cooking, hiking, and gathering around the fire in the evenings. On the 4th night, Sable began hearing things. She didn't mention it at first. She was a scientist. She had explanations for things. Ice makes noise. This is a well-documented physical phenomenon. As temperatures drop overnight, ice contracts, and the stress fractures that result produce sounds that range from a low groan to a sharp crack to, in some cases, a sound that is startlingly, uncomfortably close to a human voice. This is known. This is science. But what Sable was hearing was not the normal repertoire of ice sounds. What she was hearing, in the small hours of the 4th night, was her name. She described it to the others the next morning, reluctantly, with the careful hedging of someone who does not want to be taken as irrational. She said the ice had made sounds that rhythmically approximated the syllables of her name. Sabli, sabli, low, resonant, emerging from beneath the frozen surface with a quality she could only describe as purposeful. Fenwick, the military veteran, told her she was sleep-deprived. Thaddeus agreed. Oleander was quieter, and later admitted she had heard something too, from inside her tent, though what she heard she initially refused to describe. That night, the 4th night, Fenwick stayed up deliberately to listen. He sat by the cold fire ring, wrapped in his sleeping bag, watching the lake. He sat there for 3 hours. He came back inside his tent at 3 in the morning and woke Thaddeus. According to Thaddeus's later account, Fenwick was not afraid. Fenwick, who had been to places in the world that most people never see and survived things that would have broken most of us, Fenwick was simply very quiet and very pale. He said, "There's something under the ice. Not a fish. Not the natural settling of a frozen lake." Thaddeus asked him what he meant, and Fenwick said, "Something moving. Something big. Moving slow, under the ice, and it stops right near the shore where we're camping. Right below us. It stops and it stays." They broke camp the next morning before dawn. Here is where this story takes a turn that even a rationalist has to sit with for a moment. Sable, being a graduate student in environmental science, filed a formal report with her university's aquatic biology department describing the acoustic phenomena she had observed. One of her professors, a Dr. Augustine Vrell, took the report seriously enough to lead a small research team to Black Ice Lake the following winter. What they found was strange. The lake, acoustically, was unusual. The particular shape of the basin, combined with the density of the winter ice and the positioning of the shoreline where the campers had set up, created what Dr. Vrell described as a remarkable acoustic focusing effect. Sounds produced at one end of the lake, including very low-frequency sounds produced by the movement of large fish, most likely very large northern pike or lake sturgeon, could be channeled and amplified through the ice in ways that, under certain temperature conditions, produce sounds in the range of human speech frequencies. So there was an explanation. The scientific machinery clicked into place and generated an answer. Except, Black Ice Lake has no documented population of lake sturgeon. The lake is too small and too shallow. And northern pike, even large ones, do not produce vocalizations. Fish, with some exotic exceptions, do not make sounds with their bodies in ways that travel through ice as focused acoustic signals. Dr. Vrell's report, buried in a university database and rarely read, concluded with a paragraph that has been quietly discussed in certain academic circles. It reads, "The acoustic properties of the site are unusual and warrant further study. The source of the low-frequency vocalizations recorded during our own overnight stay at the campsite, and yes, we heard them too, clearly and repeatedly, remains unidentified." They heard them too. What do you make of a scientist saying, "I have no explanation"? What do you do with a lake that calls your name? The third story is called The Red Marker. This one is different from the others. It doesn't involve shadows. It doesn't involve sounds in the night. It involves a trail, a series of decisions, and a choice that a woman named Gretchen Mallow, 38 years old, experienced backcountry skier, certified wilderness first responder, made on a February afternoon in the Cascade Range of Washington State. Gretchen had been planning her solo ski camping trip for months. She was a meticulous planner. She had filed a trip plan with the ranger station. She had a satellite phone, an emergency beacon, an avalanche beacon, a probe, a shovel. She had everything. She had checked the avalanche forecast. Moderate risk, typical for the season, manageable if you stayed off the steep north faces. She had identified her route, her campsites, her contingency options. She set out on February 3rd, and for the first 2 days, the trip was everything she had hoped for. The Cascades in winter are extraordinary, a cathedral of white and gray and silver, the kind of landscape that makes a person feel both tiny and profoundly alive. She was moving well, covering good distance, and she documented everything in a voice recorder she carried in her chest pocket, narrating her experience with the easy fluency of someone who has done this many times. On the afternoon of the second day, she found the marker. In backcountry skiing, red markers, typically red flagging tape or red poles, are used to indicate danger. Avalanche zones. Dangerous cornices. Unstable snow. Red means stay away. Red means this is not safe. This is universally understood. The marker she found was a single red pole, planted in the snow beside the trail she was following, at a fork she had not expected. According to her maps, which she had verified multiple times, there was no fork at this location. The trail went straight. But there was clearly a fork, a set of tracks, appearing to be ski tracks, going off to the left, and her planned trail going to the right. And beside the left-hand fork, a single red pole. Gretchen did exactly what a trained wilderness first responder should do. She evaluated the situation. She looked at the tracks going left. They were fresh, perhaps a day old. The snow had partially filled them, but their shape was still clear. Someone had gone that way recently. She looked at the route to the right, her planned route. It looked fine. No obvious signs of danger. She went right, straight, as planned. An hour later, she came over a rise and stopped dead. The slope below her, the exact slope her planned route was about to descend, had avalanched. Not recently. Not today. But perhaps 2 days ago, judging by the state of the debris. The run-out zone was enormous. Blocks of snow the size of small cars lay piled at the bottom of the slope in a tumbled white chaos. If she had been on that slope 2 days ago, at any point during its roughly 2-mile length, she would have died. There would have been no survival at all. But she had been on this trail on day 1. She had been on the section above that slope. She had been fine. The avalanche must have happened while she was at her first campsite, on the night between day 1 and day 2. And her route on day 2, the route around the side of the debris field, was, she quickly calculated, going to add 5 hours to her timeline. This was manageable. She was okay. But she kept thinking about the red pole. Someone had put a red pole at the fork, beside the left-hand tracks. The left-hand route, she now understood after studying her maps more carefully, went around the avalanche slope entirely. It was longer but completely safe. Someone had known. Someone had been there before the avalanche and had marked the safe route. But who? The ranger station had no record of any trail crew or safety personnel working that area on those dates. No other trip plans had been filed for that route. The tracks beside the red pole, she had photographed them, were ski tracks, but they were an unusual shape. A narrow, old-fashioned shape. Not the wide, modern skis that backcountry travelers use today. The tracks were made by someone using very old, very narrow skis. The kind that haven't been commonly used in serious backcountry travel since the 1970s. She reported all of this when she returned. The ranger station was baffled. They sent someone to check the location of the fork, and found the red pole, still there, exactly where Gretchen had described it. But they found no other tracks in the area. Whatever snow had carried the evidence of the person who placed the marker had been disturbed enough by subsequent snowfall that nothing remained. There is a theory, and this is absolutely a theory, there is no evidence for it, that certain mountains accumulate a kind of memory. That the deaths that happen in a particular place leave something behind. Not a ghost in the theatrical sense. Not something that rattles chains and appears in white. But something subtler. A residue. A presence that knows the danger because it experienced the danger, and that tries, in whatever limited way is available to it, to help. It's a theory. You don't have to believe it. But Gretchen Mallow, the certified wilderness first responder, the meticulous planner, the person who had an explanation for everything, she believes it. She goes back to the Cascades every winter. And she says she always feels, in the right-hand fork of that particular trail, like someone is watching her. Not in a threatening way. In a careful way. The fourth story is called The Child's Voice. This is the one I want you to sit with most carefully, because it begins simply and it doesn't get simple again. In December of 2018, two experienced winter campers, a 41-year-old geologist named Balthazar Grimm and his 39-year-old partner, a woman named Vesper Crane who worked as a park ranger in a different state, drove into the backcountry of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York for a 5-night camping trip. This was their 6th winter camping trip together. They had a system. They had routines. They were comfortable in a way that only comes from years of shared experience in hard places. They set up camp on the second night near a frozen creek in a dense hardwood forest, a place they had camped once before in autumn and loved. The hardwood forest in winter is a particular kind of beautiful, all bare dark branches against white snow and gray sky, minimalist and severe, like a pen-and-ink drawing of what a forest should look like. They went to sleep at around 10 o'clock. The temperature was -12 Celsius. They had a small propane heater in the tent's vestibule, regulated carefully, with the tent ventilated per safety requirements. They were warm. They were comfortable. At approximately 1 in the morning, Vesper woke Balthazar. She was sitting up in her sleeping bag, perfectly rigid, her hand on his arm, her grip very tight. She said, "Do you hear that?" He listened. At first, nothing. Then, a child's voice. Somewhere in the forest, maybe 50 meters away, a child's voice calling out. The words were unclear. The distance and the trees and the snow muddied them, but the cadence was unmistakably a child's. The high, thin pitch of a young voice. The irregular rhythm of someone in distress. Balthazar and Vesper were out of the tent within 60 seconds. Vesper, as a park ranger, had emergency response training. They both had headlamps. They had their emergency kit. They followed the sound into the forest. The sound moved. Not drastically. Not impossibly. But every time they felt they were getting closer, the voice seemed to have shifted, as if the child were moving away from them through the trees. They pushed on. They called out. They followed for what they estimated was 15 minutes, covering perhaps 300 or 400 meters of difficult terrain in the dark. Then the sound stopped. They stood in the dark forest, headlamps cutting pale cones through the trees, breath clouding in front of them, and there was nothing. No child. No tracks in the snow. Not a single footprint that didn't belong to them. They searched a wide area. They found nothing. They returned to camp. Vesper, who is not a person given to dramatic conclusions, sat by the cold fire ring for a long time and said very little. Balthazar described her expression as the particular kind of quiet that comes not from having nothing to say but from not yet knowing how to say it. He built a small fire. They sat. And after perhaps an hour, Vesper said, "That was real. That was not our imagination. We both heard it. I had emergency training and we both heard a child in distress and we responded correctly and there was nothing there." She paused and then said, "I've been a ranger for 12 years and I have never once believed in anything I couldn't see or measure. I don't know what to do with this." They reported the incident. A search was conducted the following day by the Adirondack Forest Rangers, a thorough search, with 2 people covering the area systematically. No child. No tracks. No evidence of any human presence in the area other than Balthazar and Vesper's own campsite. Now here is the thing about this story that pulls the ground out from under you if you let it. The woods of the Adirondacks are old. The Adirondack Park itself covers 6 million acres, making it the largest publicly protected area in the contiguous United States, larger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Glacier, and the Great Smoky Mountains combined. And this park has a long, dense, layered history that includes logging operations that killed dozens of workers in brutal winters throughout the late 1800s, hunting accidents, drownings under broken ice, and most relevant to this story, a series of incidents documented by Adirondack Forest Rangers in the late 1800s and early 1900s in which hunters and trappers reported hearing children's voices in remote wilderness areas. These reports are archived. They are not widely discussed, but they exist in the ranger station records and the state archives. The most common explanation, offered by biologists and wildlife experts, is that the sound is produced by the eastern red fox. The red fox is one of the most vocal mammals in North America, and its calls, particularly the mating scream it produces in winter, which is the primary season for fox vocalizations, can sound, with startling fidelity, like a human child screaming or crying. Wilderness experts note this routinely. It is the most common explanation for child's voice reports in remote wilderness settings. But Vesper Crane was a park ranger of 12 years. She had heard red fox vocalizations hundreds of times. She knew what they sounded like. She stated categorically that what she heard was not a fox. And there were no fox tracks in the snow either. At this point, we've moved from the strange to the genuinely unexplained. And I want to pause here and ask you something. Do you think Vesper Crane, 12 years as a park ranger, emergency response training, person who never believed in anything she couldn't see or measure, do you think she made a mistake? Do you think she and her partner of 6 winter camping trips, in their second night at a familiar campsite, both dreamed the same thing simultaneously? Or do you sit with the possibility, however uncomfortable, that sometimes the darkness offers no explanation, and we have to decide how to live with that? The 5th story is called The Other Tent. In February of 2022, a solo winter camper named Isolde Fenn, 26 years old, from Portland, Oregon, a passionate and experienced outdoorswoman who documented her camping trips on a modest but dedicated online following, drove to a remote section of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state for a 4-night winter solo. She had been to the Olympics in summer twice, but never in winter. The Olympic Peninsula in winter is, by any objective measure, one of the most atmospheric and primally beautiful places in the United States. The temperate rainforest that covers much of the lower elevations receives more precipitation in winter than almost anywhere else on the continent. The trees, ancient Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, draped in moss and lichen, take on in winter rain and fog a quality that many people describe as otherworldly. The light, when it exists at all, is the color of pewter. The silence between rainstorms is absolute. Isolde set up her first camp on a designated site about 7 miles from the nearest trailhead. She documented her setup for her audience with characteristic warmth and enthusiasm. She was clearly happy. She was clearly in her element. On her second night, she documented, somewhat more briefly, that she had seen something from inside her tent that she wanted to think about before discussing. Her followers noticed the change in tone. Several commented asking if she was okay. She replied to say yes, she was fine, just processing something interesting. She never made another post after that night. She returned safely from the trip. This is important, she was not harmed, But she stopped posting entirely and has never, to the knowledge of her followers, discussed what she saw that second night. Multiple people in the outdoor community who knew her have said she seems fundamentally different since the trip. Not depressed. Not fearful. Just different, in the specific way that a person is different after seeing something they cannot explain and have decided not to try. What we do have is a voice recording she made that second night, a fragment of which was inadvertently shared in a subsequent audio clip she posted and quickly deleted. The fragment is only 12 seconds long. It contains her voice, close to the microphone, very quiet, saying, "There is another tent, maybe 20 meters, over by the big fir. There is no way there is another tent. I checked this area before I set up. I walked the whole site. There is a tent there now that was not there when I went to sleep." A 12-second audio fragment. Then silence. Then she deleted the clip. Her followers, who are passionate and dedicated, conducted something of an amateur investigation. They identified, from her earlier photographs and documentation of the campsite, that the big fir she referenced was a specific, identifiable tree in the designated camping area. Several people who subsequently camped at the same site visited the area around that tree and reported nothing unusual. No abandoned tent. No signs of previous habitation. But one person, a careful and methodical man who posts in the online communities under a name that translates roughly to Winter Brother, visited the site in the spring, after the snow had melted. He found, in the soft earth near the base of the large fir tree, evidence of previous tent pegs. Old tent peg holes, their edges weathered and moss beginning to grow, suggesting they had been there for years. Someone had habitually camped in that exact spot, probably many times, over a long period. And then, presumably, stopped. He reported this in the community. The consensus, such as it was, settled around the idea of an old campsite, pre-regulations, from before the designated site system was implemented. A former favorite spot that some long-ago camper had used repeatedly. This is a reasonable explanation. It accounts for the physical evidence. It does not account for Isolde Fenn seeing a tent. An actual tent. Structured, fabric, occupying space. In a spot where no tent was present an hour before. In wilderness medicine and search and rescue contexts, there is a well-documented phenomenon called third man syndrome, documented most famously by Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, who described the persistent sensation of an additional presence accompanying his group during their desperate winter survival journey across South Georgia Island. This phenomenon has since been documented by solo climbers, shipwreck survivors, and polar explorers. The strong, insistent perception of an additional person or presence during conditions of extreme isolation, cold, and stress. Scientists theorize it arises from the brain's neural processes under duress. But third man syndrome produces a presence, a feeling, a voice, sometimes. Not a physical object. Not a tent with structure and fabric and form. Isolde Fenn saw a tent. She was alone on an officially designated campsite with no record of any other permit issued for that night. She is 26 years old, she is alive, she is fine, and she will not talk about it. Would you talk about it? If you saw something that you knew was impossible and you had no explanation and you knew that offering the story publicly meant opening yourself to ridicule and skepticism, would you talk about it? Or would you do exactly what she did? Come home, go quiet, and decide that some things are better left between you and the dark? The sixth story is called The Last Entry. This is the hardest one. This is the one that doesn't end cleanly. This is the one that, in the research for these stories, was the most difficult to sit with, because it involves not just fear and strangeness but a genuine mystery that has never been resolved and that sits, still unresolved, in the real world. In January of 2020, a 44-year-old man named Oberon Vashti, a physician, specifically a cardiologist, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, disappeared during a solo winter camping trip in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota. The Boundary Waters is the most visited wilderness area in the United States, and in summer it is famous for its extraordinary beauty. 1,000,000 acres of lakes, rivers, forests, and sky. In winter, it is something else entirely. The lakes freeze to depths of 3 feet or more. The forest goes still in a way that summer visitors would not recognize. Temperatures routinely drop to -30°C. It is, in winter, one of the most remote and unforgiving environments in the continental United States. Oberon had done the winter boundary waters before. 3 times. He was not a novice. He had proper equipment. He had filed a trip plan. He had a satellite communicator, which he used to check in daily with his wife, a woman named Mireille, who was back in Minneapolis with their 2 daughters. He was expected back on January 11th. His last check-in was January 9th, at 6:47 p.m. In it, he told Mireille that he was camped on the shore of a lake whose name is not publicly released, that everything was fine, that the weather was going to close in over the next day, but he had 2 days of buffer in his timeline and wasn't worried. He told her he loved her. He told her to tell the girls he'd bring them something from the wilderness, a feather or a stone or something beautiful. He was never seen again. The search and rescue operation that followed was extensive. Dogs, snowmobiles, helicopter passes, trained wilderness search teams. They found his campsite. They found his gear, almost all of it. Tent, sleeping bag, cook kit, most of his food. They found his satellite communicator on the shore of the lake, perhaps 15 meters from his tent. They found his boots inside the tent. His boots. Inside the tent. Oberon Vashti walked out of his tent on the night of January 9th, or in the early hours of January 10th, in -30°C temperatures, without his boots, and was never found. The official ruling was death by exposure, a finding that is technically accurate in the sense that the cold would certainly have killed him, but which does nothing to explain the boots, the communicator on the shore, or the complete absence of tracks leading away from the camp. The snow conditions at the time, the search team noted, should have preserved tracks well. They found tracks to the shore. His tracks in socked feet, the impressions clear and terrible to contemplate. And then nothing. The tracks stopped at the shoreline. The ice showed no evidence of breakage or weakness. The tracks stopped and did not continue. Mireille Vashti has said in interviews that she chooses to believe her husband went onto the ice and that the ice has since been covered by subsequent snowfall, obscuring any evidence. She chooses to believe this because the alternative, that the track simply stopped, that a man simply ceased to exist at the edge of a frozen lake in the boundary waters of Minnesota, is something she cannot build a life around. She has 2 daughters to raise. She needs an explanation that has an end. Oberon's journal was found in his tent. It was recovered as evidence and eventually returned to Mireille, who has shared portions of it in the years since his disappearance as part of her effort to keep his memory alive and to advocate for better wilderness safety protocols. From these shared portions, we know several things. We know that Oberon was happy on this trip. The early entries are warm, detailed, and vivid, a man in his element, loving every minute. We know that on January 8th, the second-to-last full day of his life, he noted something that he described as unusual. He wrote, "Heard something tonight that I can't categorize. Not wind. Not ice. Not any animal I know. It seemed to come from the center of the lake. A low, regular sound, almost like a pulse. It went on for perhaps 20 minutes and then stopped. I have no explanation for it. We'll listen again tonight." We know that the entry for January 9th, the last entry, is only 3 sentences long. It reads, "It came back last night. Closer this time. I think it knows I'm here." 3 sentences. And then he went to his satellite communicator and told his wife he loved her and the weather was closing in and he had a buffer and not to worry. And then he walked out of his tent in socked feet in -30°C and he did not come back. I want to be very careful here about what we know and what we don't. We don't know what the sound was. We don't know what it referred to in his final journal entry. We don't know if these are related to his disappearance, or if they are simply the observations of an imaginative, intelligent man who heard something strange and then, the following night, made a decision or had an accident or experienced something that had nothing to do with whatever he had heard. We don't know. And this is the thing about winter camping stories that no amount of research, no amount of expert testimony, no amount of rational framework can entirely address. Sometimes the wilderness takes people, and it does not explain why, and the tracks stop at the edge of the ice, and the last words in the journal are, "I think it knows I'm here," and the world continues without offering you the courtesy of an answer. Ask yourself this, and sit with it genuinely. What do you think Oberon Vashti heard on that lake? What do you think he meant by it? And in the deepest, most honest part of your thinking, do you believe there was something out there on the ice? Or do you believe that the cold and the isolation and the dark had worked their way into a brilliant, experienced, rational man's mind and produced something that wasn't real? And here is the follow-up question, the one that makes this more than just a ghost story. Does it matter? Does it matter whether what he experienced was external or internal? Because the result was the same. The cold took him either way. The wilderness kept him either way. And his daughters grew up without him either way. The wilderness is not cruel. This is important to understand. People who spend their lives in wild, remote, winter places, rangers, biologists, search and rescue professionals, indigenous guides who have been reading winter landscapes for generations, they will almost universally tell you that the wilderness is not malevolent. It does not want to hurt you. It simply does not know you're there. It existed before you, and it will exist after you, and the cold and the dark and the silence that feel so threatening from inside a sleeping bag at 3 a.m. are simply the natural conditions of a world that was never designed with human comfort in mind. But then again, Corvus Hale's shadow stood still and left no tracks. Black Ice Lake called Sable Novak's name. Someone left a red pole to save Gretchen Mallow's life and used skis that haven't been common since the 1970s. Vesper Crane followed a child's voice through the forest and found nothing. Isolde Fenn saw a tent that wasn't there. And Oberon Vashti wrote, "I think it knows I'm here," and walked out of his tent without his boots into the coldest night of winter. These are 6 stories. Each of them sits differently. Some of them have explanations that you can accept if you choose to. Some of them have explanations that are technically possible, but that require you to work very hard not to notice the things that don't quite fit. And one of them, the last one, has no explanation at all, just a missing man and a frozen lake and 3 sentences in a journal and a wife who has to choose what to believe in order to keep living. There is a concept in wilderness psychology that researchers have called the threshold experience. It's the idea that there are certain environments, extreme cold, extreme isolation, extreme darkness, that push the human mind to a boundary between what it knows and what it doesn't. In normal life, in lit rooms with other people and the noise of civilization all around us, we operate confidently within what we know. The unknown stays manageable. But in winter wilderness, in the dark and the silence and the cold, the known becomes very small and the unknown becomes very large, and the mind stands at the threshold and has to decide, do I cross? Do I look? Do I follow the sound into the trees? Vesper Crane and Balthazar Grimm crossed. Corvus Hale stayed still. Gretchen Mallow went right instead of left and survived. Isolde Fenn watched and went quiet and came home. Oberon Vashti, we don't know what he decided, only that he left his boots behind. What would you do? Seriously, right now, I want you to think about it. Not hypothetically, not as an exercise, genuinely. You're in a tent. It's -20. It's 2 in the morning. Something is outside. What do you do? Most of us believe we would be brave. Most of us believe we would act rationally. Most of us have never been tested in the dark, in the cold, in the wild, and so we have the luxury of believing this about ourselves. The people in these stories, The nurse and the geologist and the ranger and the physician and the teacher and the young woman with her camera. They all believed it too. The winter wilderness is the great equalizer. It does not care about your credentials. It does not care that you've read the guides and bought the gear and checked the avalanche forecast. It does not care that you are a physician or a ranger or an experienced camper who has done this route before. It simply is what it is: cold, dark, vast, indifferent, and populated, in the margins, in the shadows, in the sounds just beyond explanation, with things that do not quite make sense no matter how long you look at them. There is a practice among certain indigenous communities of the North, the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Dean, of never speaking certain things about winter aloud. Not because of superstition, but because of respect. Because winter has ears. Because the cold carries sound in ways the summer doesn't. Because what you say into the dark of a winter night goes somewhere, and you can't always know where. The elders of these traditions will tell you, if you sit with them long enough and earn their trust, do not mock the winter. Do not dismiss what you hear in it. And if the ice speaks to you, if it says your name, if it says anything at all, the wisest thing, the most ancient and tested piece of advice across centuries and cultures and continents of winter experience, is to listen. But be very careful about answering back, because something out there might be waiting for exactly that. These stories are done now. The 6 of them sit with you, or they don't. You can file them away under interesting but explicable, and move on with your day in the light and the warmth. You can dismiss Corvus's shadow as a dream he doesn't remember having. You can explain Black Ice Lake with underwater acoustics. You can attribute the Red Pole to a trail worker whose records were lost. You can say Vesper and Balthazar heard a fox. You can say Isolde Fen saw another campsite's old poles and her tired mind assembled a tent around them. You can say Oberon Vashti made a terrible mistake in the dark and fell through ice that refroze and concealed him. You can say all of these things. They are all available to you. But ask yourself one last time the question that all 6 of these stories quietly carry inside them like a stone. If every explanation is just barely possible, just barely enough to account for just barely most of the facts, what do you do with the remainder? What do you do with the parts that don't fit? Where do you put Oberon Vashti's boots, still inside his tent, while the man himself dissolved into a frozen Minnesota night and never came home? Where do you put that? Winter is coming. It comes every year. And right now, tonight, while you are somewhere warm and lit and surrounded by the comfortable noise of your ordinary life, there are people in tents. In the dark. In the cold. On mountains and frozen lakes and in forests so deep that the nearest road is a concept rather than a fact. And some of them are lying very still in their sleeping bags, watching a shadow on the tent wall, listening to something they cannot name, feeling in the most honest part of themselves a very old feeling, older than language, older than fire, older than the first human who looked at a winter forest and felt the hair rise on the back of their neck. The feeling that something is out there. The feeling that it knows you're here. Sleep well. Keep the light on. And if you ever find yourself in a tent in the winter dark and you hear something outside that makes no sense, something that calls your name, or stands too still, or leaves no tracks, or pulses from the center of a frozen lake like a heartbeat looking for a body to belong to, remember what every story here has in common. The people who came home were the ones who listened, not the ones who went to look. Good night.